Borders, which is a Finnish NGO, but also the Secretariat for the International Network of Historians Without Borders. And if you are not a member yet of HWB or are interested in joining the international network, please access our website, historianswithoutborders.fi, for more information about our work and activities. And it's very easy to join if you feel comfortable with our declaration of our aims, to sign on without any costs, and you will be put on our mailing list. Since our we were founded in 2015, we had an international conference at the University of Helsinki in 2016, and we have also, from the very beginning, also been engaged in dealing with colonial history. And we have a very active working group on colonial history, which is also the arranger for this event. And indeed, we have hosted an international meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa, on the themes of colonial history. And we have an ambition to bring together historians from former colonial powers and former colonies to discuss and work on how to write and interpret colonial history, because most of this has been done without interaction between historians from former colonial powers and former colonies. But because of COVID and lack of resources, we have not been able to begin this project yet. But we are very happy to introduce Gurminder Bhambra, Professor of Postcolonial and Decolonial Studies in the Department of International Relations in the School of Global Studies at the University of Essex. She is also a Fellow of the British Academy and President of the British Sociological Association, and she has been previously working as a professor in the University of Warwick and also at the Linnaeus University in Sweden, also in Paris, and a visiting fellow in Princeton, etc., etc. More can be found on her website, which I would recommend that all of you visit after this event, because there is much more on that website of her writings and of her work, which is of extreme interest. So we will begin, and I would ask you to, for those who are not participating yet in the discussion, after Professor Bhambra's presentation and after the comments from Raita Merivirta, we will open the floor for a discussion, questions, and comments, and everybody can take part. But before that, please keep your cameras and microphones closed before you are given the floor. And without further ado, welcome, Professor Bhambra, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and many thanks also to the working group on colonialism within the Historians Without Borders for this invitation to speak with you today. I'm really delighted to be here, and I look forward to our conversation. The consolidation of the British welfare state in the mid-20th century didn't only coincide with the systematic dismantling of the British Empire, but it was significantly shaped by it. However, the dominant narratives situate it firmly within a national context, and what I'm hoping to do here today is to discuss the ways in which the welfare state should be understood as emerging and developing within a colonial context, and then to think about what difference that makes to the ways in which we think about politics in the present. What I would suggest is that the way in which we understand these issues shapes contemporary political debates, particularly debates over who belongs and has rights, or who should belong and should or should not have rights. And what I will suggest is that it's the failure to acknowledge the significance of colonialism to our national story that distorts the political solutions that are associated with such questions. For the purposes of my talk, the argument in brief is that the British state was a colonial state, and it was a colonial state which had a national project at its heart. The colonial state was constituted in part through the relations of extraction, to use Martin Daunton's phrase for taxation, while the national project comes into being through relations of redistribution, or more prosaically, welfare. The asymmetry between these relations is one of the consequences of the failure to understand the nation state more appropriately as the colonial state. And I will suggest that its address requires a proper accounting of our histories and a social science adequate to those histories. So I'll say a little bit about taxation first, because taxation and the way in which it's returned to citizens through welfare is one of the main ways in which the imagined community of the nation comes into being. That is, the relationship between taxes and welfare is a central part of the process of constructing institutions and the very idea of the nation. As Martin, Mehrotra and Prasad set out, and here I quote, "Taxes formalize our obligations to each other. They define the inequalities we accept and those that we collectively seek to redress." End quote. They go on to argue that a focus on taxation and the distributed returns to citizens of that taxation clarifies the nature of the state, its limits and its boundaries. So to think about income tax in particular in the context of Britain, one of the things that we see is that the first time it's raised is in 1798. And this is to cover the costs of its wars with revolutionary France. At the end of these wars, it was discontinued, and income tax is not reintroduced in Britain until the mid-19th century. During the 19th century, the military costs of the British state were largely exported to the wider empire, and specifically to India. And so we have this idea of the nation at arms, but here we should understand it particularly in terms of the empire at arms, both in terms of the personnel for the army, that is the soldiers who are fighting, but also the costs of war, which were increasingly borne through colonial taxation that was put upon the populations within the wider empire and not the nation. What this does is remove any requirement for national military conscription. So Britain doesn't have national conscription. And it also allows the domestic state, in Christopher Bailey's terms, to disarm and civilianize itself. This reduces the claims of the British state on the national economy to below the levels of the 18th century and eases the burdens of domestic taxation. So in effect, what this means is that until the First World War, the working class and most of the middle class didn't pay any income tax within Britain. If we go on to look at the issue of welfare during this period, we see that it occurs through a mixed moral economy of very limited state interventions, which are supplemented by the work of voluntary organisations, friendly societies, and private charitable activity. The low burden of domestic taxation meant that until the 20th century, the state had very little involvement in the direct provision of national welfare. For example, as Pat Thane notes, at the end of the 19th century, more money was transferred to the poor through charities in London alone than was spent nationally via the Poor Laws. Now, there's very little work on where the money that is being distributed through charity and philanthropic initiatives comes from, but there is literature on the amount of wealth brought back by individuals involved in colonial exploits. So the nabobs, as returning East India Company employees were known, were recognised to be a strong part of Britain's growing philanthropic community. As Tilman Nechtman notes, for example, newspaper subscriptions show that company employees were substantial donors to charities. But much of the scholarship on the relationship between charity and welfare very rarely acknowledges this association with colonial wealth. A recent exception is the work by Andrew McKillip. McKillip demonstrates how wealth made in empire was used to secure status back at home through activities such as contributing to the poor relief of a parish or funding hospitals and infirmaries. Further, he also shows how this imagined community of belonging was often mobilized to elicit charitable donations from members across empire for national welfare projects. In the early 20th century, there's a shift from charity, which is being funded by colonial wealth, to a national welfare regime, which, as I will set out, was also significantly funded by the colonies. First, I just want to talk a little bit about the debates that happened between welfare economists around the period of the First World War about the feasibility of actually setting up a system of national welfare that would be funded through taxation. One such economist was Arthur Bowley, and he sought to ascertain the amount of money that you could take from the rich and add to the wages of the poor such that it would both alleviate poverty but also not be an undue burden on the rich. In making his calculations, Bowley determined the national income, which was made up of the total income of people within the United Kingdom, as well as income received from abroad, deducted the amount that would be necessary for running the government, and then divided the remainder by the population of the UK. The national dividend then, that was to provide the economic basis for welfare provision, was, as Pigou writes, and I'm quoting, the objective income of the community, including, of course, income derived from abroad, end quote. Income derived from abroad was obviously income derived from colonial endeavours and empire. That the national dividend was explicitly a colonial dividend distributed nationally can be seen in the following statement, which was made in 1929 by no less a figure than Winston Churchill, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. And this is a longish quote. The income which we derive each year from commission and services rendered to foreign countries is over £65 million. In addition, we have a steady revenue from foreign investments of close on 300 million a year. This is the explanation of the source from which we are able to defray social services at a level incomparably higher than that of any European country. These resources from overseas constitute the keystone of our economic position. End quote. So what constituted these resources from overseas? The appropriation of trade surpluses and colonial taxation. The East India Company's victory at the Battle of Plassey in India in 1757 was followed by it acquiring tax revenue collecting powers in the Bengal province a decade later. The tax revenues also enabled the company to acquire export goods, technically for free, as they were purchased with those local taxes. After the imposition of direct rule by the British state in 1857, an Indian income tax was established. Colonial subjects were subject to this tax from 1860, while working class and middle class subjects in the metropole were not. The fact that there wasn't any system of political representation in India meant that the taxation system there was much more extractive than that in Britain. And as Dadabhai Naoroji stated, by examining the revenue raised in taxation as a proportion of national income, it was clear that India bore the heavier burden. But the central issue here, for my purposes, is the following, and this I'm paraphrasing from Naoroji. Not only was India more heavily taxed than England, but there was another additional circumstance. The whole of British taxation returned entirely to the people themselves from whom it was raised. But that taxation which was obtained out of India did not return to India. Instead, it went to Britain. This was also the case for surpluses from exports. As Utsa Patnaik argues, and I'm quoting, had the colony remained a sovereign country, its foreign exchange earnings would have accrued entirely to its own government. However, being a colony, the surplus was siphoned off by the metropole for its own needs. So during this period, India had the second largest merchandise export surplus globally, but the home charges were always set as higher than India's earnings, meaning that the country was kept in perpetual debt. Britain, meanwhile, despite incurring the largest trade deficits globally, was able to become the world's largest capital exporter as a consequence of the appropriation of India's earnings. Theorists of colonial drain have estimated that over 2 centuries of rule, first by the East India Company and then the British state, over $45 trillion was drained from India to the benefit of Britain. Now, the relationship between a million, a billion, and a trillion is never really clear to me. And so I'd just like to provide this example to illustrate how great a sum it is. So imagine if you were given $1 a second. In a minute, you would get $60. In an hour, you would get $3,600. It would take 1,000,000 seconds to acquire $1 million. 1,000,000 seconds is about 11.5 days. So to acquire 1 million takes 11.5 days. To acquire 1 billion would take you 31.7 years. To acquire $1 trillion at the rate of $1 per second, it would take you 31,700 years. That is 317 centuries. And Britain drained a total of around $45 trillion from India in 2 centuries. Much of this income was used for whatever the government in Westminster wished. The rest was taken as private profit by companies and individuals. And this is in part why I argue that there is nothing that has been built within Britain that hasn't been built with the wealth and resources derived from colonial appropriation from India and other colonies. But returning to the immediate post-war period, the period of the establishment of the welfare state, one of the things that we see is that Britain comes out of the Second World War owing more than £3 billion to her creditors. This is at the same time as also being committed to the construction of the welfare state. How this was to be managed was how Britain had always managed its domestic responsibilities, by turning to the empire. So there are 2 main ways in which Britain does this. First, it runs down the amount that it owes to India and Pakistan after independence. And second, it subordinates the economies of its remaining colonies to its national concerns. So by the end of 1945, Britain owed India £1.3 billion, a third of the total that it owed to the rest of its sterling creditors. In addition to cancelling a significant amount of this debt, Alistair Hinds argues that Britain also harnessed colonial resources from its remaining empire, and it aligned colonial fiscal and monetary policy to the needs of its own national economy. As Hinds sets out, and I quote, "Malaya was the most valuable of Britain's dollar-earning colonies, with its exports of rubber and tin, and this was closely followed by the Gold Coast to become Ghana and Nigeria. The dollars that were earned by these countries through the sale of their raw products were put into a dollar pool that was controlled by Britain. In this way, as David Fieldhouse argues, British colonies were made to tie up funds that they might otherwise have used for their own development in order to give Britain cheap credit and to subsidise Britain's post-war standard of living. In other words, the colonial dividend continued after the beginnings of the end of empire and was integral to the construction of the post-war welfare state. Its development in the post-war period relied on these relations of economic and political subordination, and yet there's almost no discussion of them in the wider literature. As the late John Hills argued, in an altogether different context, but useful for my purposes here, and I quote, "The redistributive effect of the welfare state cannot be judged just by looking at who benefits from it. One also has to look at who pays for it through the tax system and in other ways." End quote. The relations of extraction of the British state constituted it as a colonial state. Its relations of redistribution exemplified the national project at its heart. The injustice embodied in that asymmetry is central to arguments about the legitimacy of the claims of a white working class erroneously claimed to be left behind in competition with minorities and migrant others. These sorts of claims echo across European states, with key figures claiming that priority needs to be given to our citizens before we think about the fates of others. The welfare state, they suggest, is a result of our endeavours and is not to be shared with others. And yet those others have also contributed to the building up of patrimonies that Europe claims as its own. These claims are not tenable, however, once we take colonial histories into account, and so we need a different politics of distribution to address the inequalities and injustices that are otherwise embodied within these states. The inequalities at the heart of European states and their institutions, both individually and collectively through the European Union, are the legacy of histories of empire and colonialism. This is a legacy that fails to acknowledge the broader colonial origins of European wealth and of poverty elsewhere. While it may have been the metropolitan bourgeoisie that explicitly exploited colonized populations, as Aditya Mukherjee argues, metropolitan society as a whole benefited at the cost of the entire colonial people. There were both direct and indirect benefits to the domestic populations of taxation within the wider empire. The direct benefits resulted from the simple accrual of additional wealth and resources for domestic purposes, including the reduction in the domestic tax burden and enhanced levels of social and public services that were available nationally, but were not available to the colonized populations who had also paid taxes to the governments in the metropoles. The indirect benefits involved the compounded loss that was suffered by the colonized populations and the global patterns of inequality that continue through to the present. In these terms, it's better to understand the welfare state not as a historic achievement of a domestic working class, but rather as the amelioration of national conditions of deprivation that is funded by the labour and resources of colonised subjects who are further immiserated in the process. The idea that most European states were simply nations generating wealth endogenously is a fundamental misreading of the historical processes that produced Europe. Even those countries that are not explicitly regarded as having been colonial powers partook nonetheless of the wealth of the European colonial project through the involvement of their populations in emigrationist colonialism and through being the beneficiaries of colonial drain. The end of colonialism and empire did not bring an end to the legacies of its social structures, including their modes of legitimation. It is these that we must address and transform. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments and very interesting talk. Now we will first hear the comments from Raita Merivirta, who is a PhD docent at the University of Tampere, and then I will open the discussion. Raita, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhambra, for your very interesting talk and all the compelling arguments that you made. And I actually have a number of questions rather than comments for you. And perhaps I should ask them one at a time, or how would you prefer to?
Yeah, I don't mind.
Yeah, okay. So obviously you talked a lot about India, and India is also an interest of mine, Indian history and so on. So I was very happy to hear you talk about India, and India was such an important colony for Britain. And I was wondering what happened after India became independent in 1947. You mentioned Malaya and Ghana and Nigeria, but what kind of crisis did it cause to Britain when India became independent and they received much less colonial revenue after that? So how was that solved?
I mean, so one of the things to state at the beginning is this aspect that when India becomes independent, because of the way in which the economics were organised during the period of the war, Britain had borrowed money from the Indian colonial government as it was then. And so when India gains independence, Britain owes India in excess of £1.3 billion and so on. And so one of the first things that it does is think about ways in which it can reduce the debt. One of the things it does is it devalues its currency. Now, whilst other creditors, specifically Argentina and so on, had maintained the level of their credit notes to the earlier valuation, they refused to tie the valuation for the Indian debt in the same way. So the devaluation of sterling leads to less money that needs to be returned to India. They also cancel lots of the debt in different ways. And so scholars who have worked on this have suggested that Britain manages to reduce the debt that it owes to India by at least a third, and that's a conservative estimate. So it saves money in that way. One of the other things that it does is continue to require the newly independent government of India to pay the pensions of British civil service workers who are now leaving India and returning to Britain. So there's lots of these sorts of deals that are being done at that time. And yes, it is a shock to the financial system as a whole. And this is one of the reasons why then there's this establishment of the dollar pool. So it's the post-war period. One of the things that's missing, or that's really in need, are raw products. And the raw products such as rubber and tin are coming from places that are still under colonial rule. They sell those products on the market, they get dollars for them, but they're not allowed to keep the dollars within their own countries, but have to deposit those dollars in London. And it's only the British government in Westminster that's allowed control of those dollars. So that's cheap credit, it's additional revenue for the British state in those senses. And so this is why, there's an argument that the colonial economic policy was oriented to improving the national economy and not addressing issues of development that could have gone on in the rest of the British Empire as well. So yes, so the loss of India is a significant blow, but Britain is still at the head of quite a large global empire at that time and able to mobilize those resources as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I was also wondering, how alone are you when you're making these arguments and discussing this? Because I was thinking about, for example, Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire, and he's making arguments about how much Britain actually owes to India. Of course, he's also talking about many other things, not just about taxes and so on. But and how well have you been received in Britain? I mean, is it easy or difficult to talk about these things? And what is the sort of the general public's opinion of this? I mean, are you booed or are you celebrated in Britain when you talk about these things? And it is my understanding that colonialism and British Empire is not really taught in British schools, or at least it's not taught enough, and definitely it is not taught what the British did to indigenous populations and what they did in their colonies. It's more about a glorified history of a British Empire. So how is this, everything that you are saying, how is it received in Britain of today? And have you become like very famous because you're making these arguments, or?
No, I think one way in which these arguments are responded to is often just by ignoring them, so that you don't have to take seriously the implications of what's being presented. The issue is partly that scholars who are interested in the welfare state are often interested in what happens in Britain. Scholars who are interested in empire are interested in what happens outside of Britain. And in part, what I'm trying to do is to say that actually what happens in Britain is shaped by what happens in empire. And so we've got an overlapping space that nobody really seems to have worked within, that could actually be productive for understanding better how Britain has come to be what it is, and to think about the consequences more broadly. And when I was reading scholars who've worked on the welfare state, I don't think any of them mention empire. And when reading about newly independent India, nobody's talking about Britain, because in a sense, why would they? They've got many more things to be doing in terms of thinking about how to organize the institutions after independence and so on. When people are looking at issues of colonialism more generally, they're looking at what Britain does to empire. But this aspect of trying to account for the colonial wealth that is accumulated within Britain, in Britain, is an incredibly difficult thing, because on one level, that wealth comes in so many different ways. So if we think about the a parallel that's happening in Britain at the moment, where there's a lot of discussion, rightly so, about the abolition of slavery and how there was compensation that was paid to those who had owned other people. And there's actually a register, and you can check, this person had owned this many other enslaved people. On abolition, they got this much money, and it's clear. In terms of the amount of wealth that British colonial administrators and others brought back from India and the other colonies to Britain, it's not documented anywhere. You might find it, for example, when people die and they write wills and they have these massive estates, and so there are ways of tracing the money, but it's a much bigger and much more complex task. And the money that goes into government, there's no line in any government budget that says this is the amount we've taken from India. It's sort of submerged into broader amounts and so on, sort of home charges. Well, how does that actually enter the British Treasury? And having spoken to sort of historians who are interested in this, they say it's just incredibly difficult to trace where the money that's taken from India went to in Britain. So then it becomes difficult to account for it. But given that we know how much money was drained, it had to have gone somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
So why have we not been interested in where it's gone?
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a chance of changing general perceptions if schools were to teach more colonial history, and would this have any positive impact on attitudes towards immigration and these kinds of ideas? Because I think this is a hugely important topic. So what should be done to sort of educate the general public about this? I mean, how can your research reach more people? Or
well, I think one thing is that we have to understand that Britain's history is not a national history. It is a colonial history, but because it gets taught as a national history, then people don't understand why Britain looks the way it does. So precisely these arguments around being an immigrant and so on. I grew up in Britain, but I grew up thinking that I was an immigrant to Britain. Why? Because teachers would tell me that I'm an immigrant. School, the TV that I would watch. I then go into universities and people would be doing all this research on second generation immigrants and so on, as if migration was a quality you could inherit. And it was during the period of the infamous now Brexit debates that we were having. I was talking with my parents and saying, and my dad had kept these old passports, his old passports, my grandfather's old passports, and they were all British passports. And I was like, well, if all members of my family have held British passports for as long as there were British passports, then what makes us immigrants? And it's because the story is told of Britain having a national past instead of a colonial past that assumes that for me to be in Britain, I must have crossed a national border. But my family never crossed national borders. They circulated within the boundaries of empire. So moving from India to Kenya to Britain, they didn't move across borders, they moved within borders. And yet, because of our failure to acknowledge colonial histories, there's a presentation of us as outsiders. Now, it doesn't matter, except insofar as if we were recognized as insiders, then we would have to rethink what it means to be British. And then that would be the basis, possibly, of a different sorts of politics that was more generous and inclusive in the present, because it would understand that the wealth that we currently have is not nationally produced, but globally produced. So when there are issues globally, we have a responsibility to those issues, instead of thinking, oh no, what we must do is close the borders, build walls, keep people out, and so on. So I think to recognize colonial histories as our history would enable us to have a different sort of politics in the present.
Thank you. I have two more questions, and the first one is, did the passing away of the Queen last year and the coronation of King Charles, and because there was a lot of talk about the crown jewels and everything, did that open up any avenues for discussion of this colonial wealth? Of course, it's always a different thing if we are talking about royals or upper classes or very wealthy people, and it's a very different thing if we are talking about welfare and people on benefits. But still, I mean, do you see that there was any opening here, or has the discussion started on a more general level, or what's happening at the moment?
I mean, there were some very good reports. So The Guardian did an investigation into, you know, what is the wealth? Where did it come from? How is it being established? There's talks about the provenance of the crown jewels and so on. And in a sense, you know, and I think that's good and it's important, and we need to have these conversations about sort of theft and ownership and so on. But there is also a just much more general aspect, because if we focused just on the individuals who benefit, we don't understand how we as a country have benefited. And it becomes easier to point fingers and say, oh, well, they should return X. And I'm happy to accept that they should, or, you know, that's a conversation that needs to be had. But the conversation I'm more interested in is, given that we as a country have been established on the basis of wealth taken from elsewhere and from other populations, then what responsibility do we have collectively today to issues of inequality in other places? Now, the standard response is often, oh, well, charity or development. And I sort of think, well, poverty isn't natural. Poverty is produced. It's produced through the same processes that produce wealth in other places. So if we were to recognize that other places are poor today because we are rich, then we might need to reconsider the spatial logics, if you like, of redistribution, not simply to be national, but to be global. And given that we have such difficulty thinking about even national redistribution, how would we begin talking about global redistribution? And for me, that's something that I've begun to argue has to occur within a reparative frame, that reparations is both the epistemological frame through which to try and make sense of these connected histories, but it has to also then be underpinned by a commitment to material reparations.
Yeah, excellent points. I will soon give the floor to others, so everyone else can also ask questions. But my last question is about other European countries, and are you aware that there would be any researcher doing something similar in other European countries? Because if I think about the Nordic countries, for example, we tend to deny our colonial complicity and always say that we are so innocent and so on. And if we think about like Copenhagen, for example, built on sugar money from the Caribbean and so on, but there I haven't heard that there's so much discussion on this. So how does your project relate to other countries, and have you made any connections between other European nations?
So I mean, in terms of the specifics, I haven't, but one of the things that I do argue, and I often get this question when I talk about European colonialism, and people say, oh, well, you know, in Eastern Europe, it was different. In Central Europe, it was different. In the Nordic countries, it was different. And my argument is like, yes, but I would argue that there are three types of colonialism specifically. So there's first there's colonialism by corporation. So you have the English East India Company, you have the Danish East India Company, the Swedish East India Company. You have these trading companies that are set up in the 1700s that are not involved just in trade. They're also involved in conquest, the claiming of sovereignty, and military excursions in different places. And so there's colonialism by corporation that a lot of Europe is involved in. Then you have the classic form of colonialism, if you like, state colonialism. So the Spanish and Portuguese initially, then the British, French, the Dutch. Also the Germans, the Italians, the Belgians, and so on are involved in state-managed colonialism. And then you have a form of colonialism that German sociologists have called emigrationist colonialism. And this is when the populations of European countries take advantage of the claim of the settlement of other Europeans in what we call now the New World, the Americas, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and go and establish population colonies in these places So on the east coast of the US, for example, you have places called Swedeborough and so on, which were made up of populations of Swedish people. You have, I think there was an anarchist Finnish commune in the Midwest in different places. And so the involvement of European populations in settler colonialism of that form is itself part of what I would suggest is the broader European colonial project. So Europe as a whole is involved in this colonial project. And so when we talk about European colonialism and the need to address the inequalities consequent to European colonialism, then that's a broad question to which I'm afraid we're all involved.
Thank you. I would also like to add one more kind of colonialism, because I and my colleagues have been talking about cultural colonialism and how that has certainly affected Finns as well, even if our state never had any formal colonies, but there are these colonial ideas, and they are prevalent in science and in the arts and so on. But I will now just thank you one more time and give the floor to others. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Raida and Gurminder, for your answers. Now I open the floor for questions, so please raise your hand if you want to take the floor for a comment or a question. But there is one question already in the chat from Abraham Sunita. Perhaps I would ask Sunita, would you like to present your question yourself? So please just open your microphone and camera.
Hi, Professor Bhambra. As always, lovely to hear you and to hear more about this work. And I think in many ways, I know that the answer will be yes, but I wanted very much to ask that the research that you're talking about, of course, is colonial, and the modern version of that we see in the UK is through high international fees sourced from students in ex-colonies like India, Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, finances that are used both to prop up the universities in terms of infrastructure, resourcing more broadly, but also to subsidize domestic British students. So in many ways, this extraction is continuing, and it's resonating with these debates, which is, the misinformation on immigration statistics being used then. So I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the question. I mean, I would sort of say in many ways, yes. So in the past, and by the past, I mean probably like 20, 30 years ago, in Britain, fees for home students were paid for by the state through the taxes that were collected nationally. And so in that context, to have different fees for overseas students versus different fees for home students had a logic in its own terms, i.e., taxpayers' monies were being used to pay for the fees of home students. There was an argument that overseas students should therefore pay fees for themselves. However, once the reforms to university higher education have meant that the taxpayer no longer contributes directly to the fees that are paid by students, but instead students are required to take out loans themselves in order to pay these fees, they've privatized them to the students. Now there's no rational reason why overseas students should pay higher fees than home students, because the reason that had been there for that has disappeared. And yet we maintain a system still of much higher fees for overseas students than home students. And it's not clear what the rationale for that would be. And I think that that is something that needs to be addressed. Having said that, one of the ways in which universities would likely address it if the distinction was abolished was to move fees up for everybody. And that's, so it's a complicated topic, but you're absolutely right in the posing of the question.
Well, thank you very much. Please raise your hand if you have a question or a comment, but I don't see any hands at the moment, so I will ask you. You have elsewhere quoted William Faulkner, that the past is never dead. And I think that's a good quote. And the past of colonialism is still not dead. It's there, but you haven't mentioned the word neocolonialism. So how much of these structures, which you described so thoroughly, are still working and in existence?
I mean, I think that's a huge question, and it would require so much more sort of work in order to give a full answer. And I think that many of the structures, particularly the economic structures that were put in place during the period of colonialism, haven't actually disappeared. They continue through things like the World Bank, structural adjustment programs, and others. And they're also evident in things like, for example, I think is it 7 or 9 former French colonies in West Africa continue to be required to have their currencies pegged to the French franc, even though the French franc no longer exists, and now it has to be pegged to the euro. And the French government maintains control of their gold reserves and their currency policies. Ndongo Sambasila and Fanny Pigot have written a brilliant book recently on the colonial currencies issues in relation to these countries. And so I think there we see very clearly that that whilst there may be political independence, which marks a difference from previous political subjugation under direct colonial rule, the economic processes that were part of colonialism haven't actually been transformed, they've just often been renamed. And so the fact that formerly colonized countries continue to pay so much more in terms of interest on debt and loans to formerly colonizing countries is part of that same process. But that hasn't been the focus of my research, but I think that would be related to the arguments that I'm making.
Thank you. And I have 2 questions. First from Tuomo Melasuo. Tuomo, please.
First, it's my pleasure to thank you for this very brilliant and interesting lecture you did. I would like to ask your attention for a few things. You are right when saying that there is very few studies on the taxation in the colonial empires. I recall one very interesting concerning Algeria. It was done in somewhere in the early 90s by Claude Collot, and it's concentrated on the communal taxes in Algeria. And it was somehow interesting to see that this colonial taxation was the main tool for economic exploitation of the Algerians during all this, let's say, almost 130 years long colony. That time Algeria were divided in 3 different kind of colonies. The first one was the so-called colony of plein d'exercice, full right colonies, same as in metropolitan France. Then there was the so-called mixed colonies, and the third one was the military reasons, territoire militaire. And it was clear that this colony, the plein d'exercice, was the worst one for the Algerians, and they preferred either the mixed colony or the military territoire, where the army was much more, let's say, decent in his attitude towards the local population than the European-run municipal assemblies, which taxated the Algerians but used all the money in their own benefits. And that was the real problem. So you had this study of Claude Collot on that topic. I think it's almost the only one we have on the colonial taxation in the communal level in that country. But the other thing I wanted to say that there is few very interesting studies concerning this issue, which I came across recently. I came across 2 articles in Le Monde. The first one was paying attention to the economic crowd and inequalities, how they have a historical, historical roots in the colonial period. The economists like Thomas Piketty and the American historian Kenneth Pomeranz were debating and linking all the three elements: the inequality, the connection with the social and political conflicts in the colonies, as well as the environmental issues. And the other one is the question of slavery. And it's also rather interesting where they also refer to this book of Thomas Piketty concerning the increase of the inequalities in today's world. But I will stop here.
Okay. Thank you for that. I mean, so I think Piketty has done a lot to bring up questions of taxation and the relation to issues of global inequality in current years, especially his what was it, Capital in the 21st Century, and then Capital and Ideology as well. The difficulty that I have with his analysis is partly that he presents it's organized in terms of a methodological nationalism in a sense. So he compares the economies of Britain with the economy of India, for example, over 200 years. But for much of that period, of that 200 years, India was a colony of Britain's. It didn't have an independent economic policy. It didn't have an independent economy. Its economy was subordinated to the needs of Britain. And so to sort of disaggregate Britain and India and to say these are two units, we're going to compare how well they did over 200 years, doesn't take into account the political and economic subordination that existed over those 200 years. So I would suggest that what is needed is to think about them within a colonial frame. And he also does that with thinking about France and Haiti, for example. So he sort of says Haiti independently, France independently, let's compare the two entities. And I would suggest that given that Haiti was a colony of France, you can't compare them, but you have to understand the ways in which Haiti's economic development was subordinated by and to the French. And so I think that there are those issues. But on the more general point on how few, how little scholarship there is, I mean, there is some by historians looking specifically at issues of taxation in particular places, but there's very little that then thinks about what the consequence of that taxation is on the metropoles. So in the same way that I've presented this about Britain, there would be sort of greater studies to be done, for example, on the relationship between the Netherlands and Indonesia, for example, because when the Netherlands Union broke up, when Belgium and so on became independent and the Netherlands was left on its own, in order to make up for the loss of revenue that would be coming from the other parts of the previous, I think, what was it, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, they established a 30% taxation on Indonesia, which was then brought in to subsidize welfare arrangements within the Netherlands. And so I think in that sense, there are many of these stories that need to be told.
Thank you. And the next comment and question comes from Risto Marjumaa. Risto, please, and then afterwards Noel Whiteside.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Risto Marjumaa. I'm a university lecturer in Helsinki and have done colonial studies as well in my PhD, for example. I quite agree with all you are saying about British Empire. It was a horrible empire, actually, and it was lynching its empire. I think that counting the money that was brought in, you should probably also include informal empire, especially Latin America. I think that what Churchill was talking about included also a large amount of income that was brought in from there. But my question is that concerning the legitimization, so-called, of the British Empire, that was based mainly on race, on their ideals of race, of white race. So how do you see from economic point of view the position of the white dominions, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, on what side were they? Were they beleaguered or were they being received on the receiving side?
I haven't looked at the relationship of the dominions and what happens to the taxation that's collected there, but the dominions were white settler countries. So in a sense, in those contexts where you have British people moving to other parts of the world and establishing modes of governance in those places, they begin to argue more quickly for the right to be able to keep more of their revenue for local considerations and so on. And so I don't know the exact details because I've been focusing on the relationship between India and Britain and not the other ones, but that would certainly be an interesting avenue to explore further. I mean, if we think about it in terms of immigration policy, for example, we note that the British government allows Canada, Australia, New Zealand to determine their own migration policy, which is harsher on racial grounds earlier than it is within Britain in its own terms. So Britain has to maintain the legitimacy of empire, so can't really say that people shouldn't be allowed to move within it, whereas Canada and Australia implement whites only policies in the early 20th century in order to stop the global nature of empire from being able to be global, whereas Britain doesn't do that, not until the 1960s with its Commonwealth Immigration Acts. So there are differences, and I think precisely the fact of being settler colonies, the dominions have a very different relationship to Britain than the colonies themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Noel Whiteside, please.
Hello, Gurminder.
Hi.
For the purposes of introducing myself to the rest of the company, because I haven't participated before, I'm one of those ghastly, elderly, white welfare historians who have taken an interest in how the British welfare state, past and present, developed. And Gurminder and I, at one stage in our respective careers, worked at the same institution. So Gurminder knows me. I'm afraid the rest of you don't. I thought it was a very interesting talk, Gurminder, and I commend you on your identification of India as being the source of much British wealth. I think you overstate the amount of wealth that could be derived from the rest of the colonial empire. I have recently, for my sins, taken upon myself to look at the period of decolonization in the context of the Cold War. And so I'm beginning to read around about it a little. Now, the first thing that strikes me, I was absolutely convinced about the expropriation of wealth from the colonies. There's no doubt, otherwise why do it? However, when it came to the link to the welfare state, my suspicions started arising. Now, what else was this tax? The money invested in gilts through the London markets. If you wanted to talk about why London is the central money market of the globe, the answer is empire. But what else was the British funding? And the answer is surely all those armed forces settlements dotted all over the globe, in Malta, in Cyprus, in Aden, in Singapore, to keep the trade routes open and to protect not just colonial trade, but para-colonial trade with areas such as Latin America. I was recently reading, apropos absolutely nothing actually, some cabinet minutes from 1900, where the cabinet was getting terribly excited about oil, Persian oil, not a colony, but owned by British companies and the source of British petroleum eventually. So we have this fluidity about colonialism that you reap the profits. I don't think they do go domestically, you see. I think they're reinvested overseas. I have no proof of that. I just float it as a suggestion. So that British, or they go to tax havens. I'm not terribly sure much of it goes into the welfare state. That's what's bothering me.
I mean, it's so good to have this conversation because in a way, you know, these are precisely the sorts of questions that I'm grappling with. And it's like who to have the conversation with, because it's crossing these different fields. And I agree. So I don't think necessarily the majority of money from colonialism goes into the welfare state. But for me, to make the link between income tax being levied on colonial populations, but the refusal to provide welfare of any sort, even in the context of the most catastrophic famines that happen under British colonial rule in India, whereas, you know, the way in which as sociologists and social policy people, we think that taxation and welfare is inextricably linked, so that if you pay taxation, you should be able to expect something in return. And part of what I'm seeking to demonstrate is that, well, actually, what constitutes Britain as a colonial state are these relations of extraction that it enables it to sort of extract revenue from the colonies. But why we think of Britain as a nation is because its welfare was only ever distributed nationally, not to the tax citizenry, but only to its national population. Then there's a bigger question of what happens to the amount of wealth, like that 45 trillion that Nike and other economists talk about, isn't all going into the British state. I absolutely accept that, because Britain, you know, we would have streets paved with gold if that were the case, but it's going into the pockets of private individuals who initially are able to maintain their wealth just simply through the vagaries of the policies that enable that, such as the non-dom status that's come back to prominence with Rishi Sunak and his wife not having to pay tax because of claiming this status. That comes in explicitly as a colonial policy to enable people who make their wealth in empire not to be taxed in Britain on their colonial wealth. Once you begin to have decolonization, you begin to have an issue, or the rich begin to have an issue of how do we keep our wealth out of the purview of the state and not pay taxation on it. And that's when you begin to have the emergence of tax havens and offshoring. And offshoring is not just in the Caribbean, it's also in London, in Switzerland, and other places. So Vanessa Ogle has this wonderful piece on funk money, where she talks about the ways in which the rich are literally moving around the countries that are not yet colonized, are not yet decolonized, in order to protect their money, until eventually it ends up in tax havens. And now you've got colleagues like Alex Cobham and others from the Tax Justice Network desperately trying to expose those sorts of things. But it's, you know, so for me, it's like how to get at that bigger picture. Well, let's look at income tax, because it has that resonance to us that if we pay income tax, we should get something for it. And yet we don't in the colonial context. So how can we use that to reconsider arguments around legitimacy and entitlement in Britain? And then there's this bigger project of where does all the money go? Does that sort of...
Yes, it does sort of. I mean, that you certainly address the issue of the public and the private. And certainly the British system of government is to encourage the private and not tax it, because otherwise all these people will go somewhere else, probably America. But I still think, when I'm looking at the 1950s quite closely, and the costs of all those military establishments, to use a blanket term, dotted all over the globe, is actually forcing the Treasury to push for cuts in the National Health Service more or less as soon as it's formed. And it's therefore the idea that somehow or other, and Britain has got one of the meanest welfare states in Europe, which also sits poorly when it's got one of the biggest empires or one of the biggest imperial inheritances. So, I mean, there are some discrepancies here, and I think your argument would be strengthened.
But one of the things that it does have is the greatest welfare for the least national tax. You know, so if we look at the relationship between tax and welfare across other European countries, we realize that most other European countries pay a higher proportion in tax that actually goes specifically to welfare, whereas Britain always had, what was the term?
Frugal.
Well, but that aspect where your tax doesn't have to go for the thing that you say.
Non-hypothecated.
Yes, exactly. So the fact that we have non-hypothecated taxes means that there's no relationship between tax and welfare, and that the money can come from anywhere. The other thing to say, and again, this is a sort of slightly reverse argument, is that if we see the point at which funding for the welfare state really dramatically declines, it's the 1970s. The 1970s is at the point at which the British Empire is fundamentally dismantled. And so for me, it's more than a coincidence that the point at which the British Empire is finally dismantled, which is the 70s, is precisely the point that you have diminishing revenue for the national, for the welfare state. And then you have the discovery of oil, North Sea oil, which comes in, and we don't do what sensible countries like Norway do and establish a sovereign wealth fund that could generate income over time. We give it away in tax cuts, so that again, we don't invest that money in any meaningful way. So I think Britain's always had this very peculiar relationship between tax and welfare, and that welfare in Britain, to the extent that it has existed with others paying for it, not with Brits themselves paying for it through tax. First it was empire and then it was oil. And now I don't know what it's going to be. And that's the question we're going to have to face.
Yeah. I don't think actually in the 50s you're right, but I will just agree to differ on that. I don't want to hog the...
I have to do more research, more conversations.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I don't see any new hands up, but I have some questions. You mentioned oil and oil revenues, but that's a very interesting phenomenon in today's world, because the kind of accumulation of trillions and billions and trillions you see now is accruing to countries, some of which were former colonies in the Middle East, and other countries who have been fortunate to discover oil. So how does this fit in with your grand scheme of explanation?
So in the context of oil, I was just that the reference point was partly thinking about what Norway did after discovering oil and setting up a sovereign wealth fund, which enabled it to sort of think about how to provide welfare without having high levels of taxation or without sort of, and now there are conversations happening in Norway about what do people do if you're committed to the green agenda, for example, to the profits that have accumulated over time as a consequence of an investment in a product that is largely responsible for the sorts of changes we're seeing to the climate and so on. And I think these are conversations that do need to be had. I haven't thought a lot about that. That was just a comment in relation to issues of taxation and welfare. But I think it's certainly an interesting thing that we would need to think about much more.
Thank you. I will also use the opportunity to return to what I said at the beginning about our Historians Without Borders ambition to bring together historians from colonial powers and former colonies. You told us interestingly about the discussion and in Britain and the debate in Britain about colonial history, but how much are historians from former colonies involved in this? So do you think that our idea and our ambition to bring these two schools together has any merit?
I mean, I think it would be a great idea. And I was sort of thinking, it's not as if the people who I'm reading and whose research I'm mobilizing in order to make these arguments was somehow lost to British scholars. So if we think about Dadabhai Naroji, he's one of the first who establishes this idea of colonial drain. He writes a book called How the British Made India Poor. I forget the exact title. And it's published in English in England in 1901. Not only is the book already written in English and published in England, but he himself comes to be elected as an MP for one of the London boroughs and sits in Parliament for a number of years. So he's a known figure. He's somebody that, is part of the political establishment. He's making these arguments about colonial drain. A number of Indian economists are making the arguments about the relationship between the amount of wealth that's being extracted by Britain from India over the period of the 20th century at the very least. And in the present, you also have economists like Utsa Patnaik and others, many of whom did their PhDs at Cambridge, and the Cambridge Economics Department had a number of colleagues who were from India, and these debates are happening. And yet somehow the arguments that they make in the context of thinking about the relationship between India and Britain, these are not conversations that those in Britain think it's important also to engage with. So that sense of thinking specifically about how does empire affect Britain? And we see that sort of more generally with, post-colonial, decolonial theory. It emerges often by people who come from the colonies to try and make sense of that relationship. But within Europe, it's as if, colonialism, if it happened over there. It's really got nothing to do with us. We are who we are. And colonialism was just an episode of history. Whereas for those who were colonized, it can appear to be almost the entire determining thing. And so Edward Said sort of 40 years ago made that observation. And so to the extent that the work that I do is focused very much on Europe. It's about wishing Europe to take seriously its colonial histories in order to be able to properly understand its post-colonial present. And that's something that I think it would be very useful for Europeans to take seriously their colonial past.
Thank you. And Timo Uotila has asked for the floor, please. Please open your microphone. We can't hear you. Please open your microphone.
I can just quickly add that it seems that Timo's microphone is not recognized at all by the program, but maybe you can ask your question in the chat so we can then repeat it. There seems to be some technical problem on your end, I'm afraid.
By the way, your voice is now heard. Try again.
I think the problem is that the microphone is somehow not connected to the program. It's not recognized by the program, so maybe it's better to write the comment in the chat. Perhaps while we are waiting for Timo's question to hopefully to come to the chat, maybe I could just briefly ask you, and thank you, of course, for a very interesting presentation. I think Raita kind of touched on the topic, but I would like to hear your further thoughts on of course, you know, now many of us who are attending are from Finland. And of course, for us, it is very interesting to hear, of course, you focus on Britain and the colonial empire of Great Britain. But what do you personally see? Where would you like this analysis of the taxation to be applied to which other countries or contexts? What would you find interesting, or what would you find somehow could prove some interesting linkages or some kind of dynamics in other countries as well?
Is it now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Perhaps you can also ask your question, and then Gurminder can answer both of our questions. Thank you. Yes, we can hear you, Timo. You can go ahead and ask. Timo, do you hear us?
I can't hear you now. Well, use the chat, and Gurminder will answer Heta's question.
Okay, so I mean, I think so. What I'm interested in is the relationship between taxation and welfare in part. So I think it would be interesting to look at that relationship in different sorts of contexts. Who was being taxed, and then who was seen to be the responsibility of the state for welfare. And when there's a discrepancy between the two, then we need to think about what that discrepancy was about. So I think it's most clearly present in the relationship between Britain and India, for example, where colonial subjects in India were subject to taxation, but there was absolutely no consideration that any of that taxation should be returned to them as welfare. And then to sort of think through the implications of that argument. I know that this is also the case for the Netherlands and in relation to its colonies in Indonesia and so on, and thinking about it in relation to France and the colonies that it has. There are other sorts of relationships, you know, so that's just in terms of relationship between taxation and welfare. I think the Spanish Empire as it existed and the Portuguese as well organized things differently to the British, Dutch and French. And so again, it would be interesting to explore that in more detail and to think about what those differences were and why they may have existed and what the sort of ongoing consequences of those differences might be in terms of questions of legitimacy and so on. So these are all things that in a sense open up by looking at that relationship between taxation and welfare.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. I don't see now that Timo's microphone is not working, and you have not sent a question in the chat either. So I'm afraid that we have to conclude that everybody who has asked for the floor has made their questions. So it is time to thank you very much for your presentation and for this very interesting discussion. I think that we have learned quite a lot today, and I hope that this is not the end. This is really a beginning of also working across borders on colonial history, and we will be sure to return to you and ask your advice and to hope to have your engagement for our future work. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody for attending this discussion, and we will return with the Colonial Working Group of Historians Without Borders, again with several discussions then in September. We have already in the pipeline, but for now I wish you a very nice midsummer and a warm summer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for all.